So now as researchers, we are ready to interpret our data about how much time 7th graders spend playing their instruments. So on my box plot, right on this number line down here, all of these numbers stood for number of hours playing an instrument. So to help myself remember to talk about that, I'm just going to write that on my box plot. So this is hours playing instruments per week. And there are two main ideas that I want to talk about when I'm describing data. The first is center. The center of the data. I've highlighted the center of my data in yellow. The center of the data is talking about the middle 50% of people. How did we find the middle 50% of people that we talked to? People who were the most average or typical in terms of how many hours they spent playing their instrument. As we look over here, if we look at the original data set, one really sticks out, the 9. Right, the 9 is really not typical, and notice how far away it is from what we call the center of the data, the middle 50% of people. So in this yellow box represents 50% of the people who I talk to. And then on the outskirts, from here on, that only represents 25% of the people I talk to. And between 0 and 1, that's the other 25%. So in total, that's 100% of the people I talk to, but the bulk of them fall here in the center. The other thing we want to talk about is range. How much did it vary? Were people really consistent with how many hours they spent playing an instrument, or was it really spread apart? So we're going to use some of those important things we calculated in the last video to talk about those. The quartiles, Q1, Q3, and median, those are going to talk a lot about our center, while the range and the IQR, the interquartile range, is also a range, and it talks about variability and spread. Right? How spread apart are things? What are our ranges? How much do they vary? So about those two main ideas, I came up with a bunch of sentences. Now, you wouldn't have to come up with every one of these sentences, but for your own data, but here are some examples of sentences you could write. So first, let's talk about the center of the data. So, from looking at the median, I can talk about what a typical 7th grader does. So, a typical 7th grader spends about 2.25 hours, 2.25 hours, playing an instrument each week. So notice how I use the word about. Nobody in my list played exactly 2.25 hours. However, that was right in the middle of the data, so people did spend around that much time doing that. So that's what I get from the median, and that's talking about the center, the typical student. If I look at my box in between quartile 1 and quartile 3, where 50% of my surveyed people fall into this information, I could say 50% of 7th graders spend between 1 hour and 3.5 hours playing an instrument each week, because 50% of people were in that amount of hours. If I wanted to talk just about my quartile, my first quartile, I could say only 25% of 7th graders spent less than 1 hour playing an instrument each week. And we could see that because there's only 25% of people were between 0 and 1 hours playing an instrument. If I wanted to talk about my third quartile, where that encompasses all the way up all of those data points, 3/4 of the way through my data, I could say 75% of 7th graders spend no more than 3.5 hours playing an instrument each week, right? Because 75% of them are at 3.5 or below. I could also write a sentence that said, only 25% of students spend more than 3.5 hours playing their instrument each week. So there are so many ways you can talk about it, but when you're talking about the center, you're going to be talking about the percentages of students that fall in different places. You're going to be talking mostly about what's going on inside that yellow box and what's happening around our median. That talks about the typical student, who's at the center. The other thing we could talk about is called spread, like I said, and that is all about the ranges. So from my range, I'm talking about what's the difference between the person who spends the most time and the person who spends the least time. And that's a pretty big gap, right? The person who spent 9 hours, we said that person's probably doing a lot more than everyone else. Overall, the number of hours that 7th graders played an instrument each week varied a lot. There was a difference of 9 hours between the 7th grader who played the most and those that played the least. So that's just the difference between the two endpoints. It was pretty far apart, thinking that most of our data fell within 2.5 hours. And that's the other thing we can talk about. How spread apart is this little box? So the middle 50% of people, the typical students, the middle 50% of 7th graders surveyed only varied by 2.5 hours. So they were much closer together. So we could say in general, students definitely fall into this range, and there's like a 2.5 hour difference between them. So these are some examples of sentences you could write. And when you're doing your own data, you're going to change the numbers, and you're going to change what you're talking about, playing an instrument each week, to whatever your project is about. But you can use the same sort of setup that I did for this. I hope that this helped, and I look forward to reading what you learned from your data.